مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. نحن في منتصف فصل الصيف، حين يبدأ الحر الشديد في واشنطن يمثل شبه جزيرة العربية، ويبدأ كثير من الناس في الإيمان بظاهرة الاغترار العالمي. غادر الرئيس والكونغرس ومعظم واشنطن البلد في طريقهم إلى الشاطئ، الجبال أو أي مكان. لم تختف مشكلات دولتنا، وإنما اختفى فقط الأشخاص المنتخبين لحلها. إذن هذه فرصة مثالية لنعود فنلقي نظرة على الضيوف الرائعين الذين شرفنا بصحبتهم في برنامج داخل واشنطن على مدار العام الفائت. ضموا جمهوريين وديمقراطيين، صحفيين وسفراء، مسؤولين حاليين وسابقين من مختلف الفروع التنفيذية والتشريعية للحكومة. وفيما يلي بعض من أهم ما جاء على ألسنتي. So you think it's a much more complex story than most?
It's very complex. And then not only that, I want to add something else. When President Barack Obama was running against his candidate, Republican candidate John McCain, he said to me, he said there's subtle and overt racism out there. He said this, President George W. Bush. And then the day after the election for Barack Obama, when Barack Obama became the 44th president, well, he was president-elect as the 44th president of the United States, I was standing outside of the Oval Office, and you could see the president. He was angry, and I never found out why he was so angry, but he was walking, pacing back and forth in the Oval Office, and we were waiting for him to give a statement outside the Rose Garden. And Robert, let me tell you what he did. He was just angrily pacing back and forth, and I looked through those French doors, and you know what he did? He looked back at me, and I'm gonna show you what he did. He raised the roof and fell out laughing. So he was actually happy that the change had happened, but I don't know what happened in that room. And it changed the tension. That laughter changed the tension so much in that room. Steve Hadley, his national advisor at the time, came to the door and looked and saw me laughing, and he said, "Oh, we understand." So his presidency is very complicated.
All right, well, let's move on to the current president.
Okay.
Barack Obama. Black president or post-racial president?
I like your questions. I'm sorry for just jumping like
It's all right.
But that's a good question, because I asked the president that question when we were flying down to Selma for the 50th anniversary of the march in Selma, Bloody Sunday March, just not long ago. And I said, Mr. President, and this is
the historic civil rights event 50 years ago, Martin Luther King leading a group of protesters across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
And they were beaten, hosed, and dogs were turned on them just for the right to vote 50 years ago. So President Obama took a group of black journalists, 5 black journalists on Air Force One to Selma, Alabama, and to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and to hear this historic speech. But before we did that, we were in the Flying Oval, well, we were in the conference room adjacent to the Flying Oval office. So I said, I got the first question. I said, Mr. President, so many people say, that we're now in the post-racial era, but once you leave office, some are saying that it's going to be not post-racial, it will be termed post-Obama. And this is very interesting what he said. He said, April, he said, with humility, he said, my election was historic, but he said, I cannot equate being elected president to the significance of the changing of laws, like the Emancipation Proclamation to set the slaves free under Abraham Lincoln, or the Civil Rights Act under LBJ and Kennedy, and also the Voting Rights Act under LBJ. He said he cannot equate just being president to that, but he said what his is to do now is to bridge the gaps of all the racial issues that there are now. So I found that interesting. So some people say post-racial, and there's the thought that there will be post-Obama, but I think it's all in the same context. It's all about race, and we'll see how the nation changes, or if it goes back, or if it goes forward after President Obama.
With a Republican Party as fractious as it is today with so many candidates, how deep is the fear that if somebody's candidate doesn't emerge, that a slice of the electorate just won't show up on election day? That the ideology, the personality, whatever it is, they won't be united enough come November 2016.
I don't think that's a fear this time around because of the unity of opposition to Hillary Clinton. I think that she is going to unite our party like nobody, even including Barack Obama, has ever done. And so I think that's really less of a factor. I just think that Hillary is such a polarizing figure, especially for Republicans, that people are going to turn out like they never have before.
Interesting. And I know you focus so much on what's going on Capitol Hill. There's some tension between Republicans who are eager to show that they can get things done, which will require some cooperation with Barack Obama, as opposed to some candidates who want to throw Barack Obama into the Atlantic. How does that tension play out in presidential politics?
Well, we're seeing some problems in the Senate actually from this dynamic. You have Senator Rand Paul blocking some legislation on the Senate side because he's trying to make a political point, whereas Republicans who are there simply to legislate are trying to actually get some things done, like a big trade deal with some Asian Pacific countries. But what senators who are running for president are looking to do essentially in this last few months when Congress is going to be doing anything before the election is show that they can actually get something done. It's hard to do, unfortunately, because of the way Congress works. But it's going to be important overall for Republicans to prove in Congress that they are able to make deals with the president, and that's why we see this trade deal getting so much play.
And will Congress have any, the congressional leadership have any impact at all on who emerges from this pack?
They do in the support and the way they lend their own political organizations. You know, for instance, Speaker Boehner has his own political organization nationally as well as in Ohio. So his vote and his support is very important. And likewise, there are certain leaders in the party that serve as members of Congress that all the candidates want to have their support, because that's part of the surrogate and the endorsement game. And that's where they can play a big role with their organization and their vocal support. And being willing to stand with them on podiums in these various states that are swing states and important political states across the country.
Let me ask you about Russia. We're involved in a competition with Russia over Ukraine at the same time as America gets more deeply engaged here.
Russia has its own violent Islamist problem in places like Chechnya and Dagestan, in the Caucasus. And in fact, the United States felt some of that wrath, unfortunately, with the Boston Marathon bombers. So Russia, has multiple concerns. Once again, this situation, whether you're talking about China, Russia, or other countries, this is not an easy problem. And I'm sure that all of the states, including the United States, would rather be spending their time and money and effort on other issues.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're one of these sort of competitors of the United States, but yet you have your own jihadist threat either inside your country or on your borders, do you think you prefer the United States taking a lead role against the jihadist threat? Or are you a bit gleeful that the America is getting back in the swamp of the Middle East and getting tied down in this difficult problem?
It's a very good point, Rob. For instance, China, I'm glad you brought that up. President Obama early in his administration talked about a pivot to the Pacific, or a rebalancing to the Pacific, where there was going to be a shift in U.S. assets from the Atlantic theater, which would include the Middle East, to the Pacific. For instance, naval ships, which are basically about 50% in the Atlantic and 50% in the Pacific now, would go to 60% in the Pacific and 40% in the Atlantic. This was of concern to China. China felt it was a strategy to perhaps contain China or constrain China, to balance China. So if you saw the United States being able to send its assets in that direction, this may be of some satisfaction to you, because it will limit America's freedom of action. We're spending money that may not have been budgeted. We have budget constraints for our military. The president is going to be spending a lot of money with the Ebola virus to try to help Africans to contain this terribly deadly disease. So if you are a competitor of the United States, whether you're Russia, China, perhaps others, and the United States is distracted by a strategic challenge in another part of the world, I think that would be of some satisfaction.
Let's move to presidential politics for a minute. Most Republican candidates have said that should they be in the Oval Office in January 2017, they'll rip up the accord. Is that a realistic position for them to be taking?
Not at all, because it means they're walking away from the rest of the world. They're walking away from the P5+1. They'll be isolating the United States. If there is, we're not changing that Iran is changing its character overnight, and so there'll be continual challenges by Iran that need to be met and directed. And if Iran does defect from this agreement and there's a military course that may be needed down the road, we'll be standing there alone and not with the rest of the world. So you're hearing election posturing right now, but I remember Ariel Sharon once saying that once you're behind the prime minister's desk in Israel, you have to weigh a lot of different issues, and not everything is after the pullout from Gaza. It's the same for the President of the United States. You'll have someone, Republican or Democrat, who come in, and they will largely have a continuous foreign policy, just as Barack Obama did from George W. Bush, even though he ran against so many of the things that Bush and Cheney did. Barack Obama did not rip up the arrangements they had. They kept going on drones from on. I mean,
you know, one of the interesting dynamics for the Republican presidential candidates and for this vote ahead is we haven't talked about people like Henry Kissinger, Jim Baker, Condoleezza Rice, Brent Scowcroft, major foreign policy figures from previous Republican presidencies. They will be saying no president could rip up the accord after he takes over, because the damage done in our relations with our allies, the word that the United States has, so many areas, it would be disastrous. And I'm assuming that many of them, not all of them, are going to be saying, even if there are things in this accord we don't like, it was done with the P5+1, it's got support in the United Nations. If you reject it, then it's a deep and damaging blow to America's credibility and to relations with our allies in this way. And while that won't affect...
You mean if you vote against it, or if you're the new Republican president?
The new Republican president.
And if you're a new Republican president, but also, I suspect they're going to be saying you should support this accord for those reasons. Some of them will.
I think there'll be a division amongst
yes.
that group.
Well, George Shultz is likely to say no, but I wouldn't be surprised if Kissinger and Baker say, yes, go ahead and support it. And if that's the case, it's not going to affect what rhetoric is used by Republican presidential candidates, but it muddies the waters a little bit more in trying to draw such a sharp line between the weak and ineffectual president and the strong Republican.
Steve, we only have a few seconds left. Steve earlier mentioned Hillary Clinton and the quandary this puts her in. Is there a quandary for Hillary in this?
Right now, Hillary has supported the accord, but said, and this is an important matter, if there are any violations, we should come down hard militarily. She's trying to keep that strong national security stance while also supporting her president. And I think that also will give some backing to those nervous Democrats in Congress who will end up supporting it.
So when you look back over the last 3 or 4 years, what would you have liked to see the Obama administration do in the face of this set of challenges that it didn't do? Can you identify a couple of key moments or key decisions that you looked at and you said, boy, I wish that they had done this differently?
Yeah, I think we all were very excited when President Obama made his statement in Cairo about the involvement of the United States and how the United States was going to engage not only the Arab community but Islam in the region. And then he didn't follow through. As a matter of fact, what he did was send every signal, whether intentional or not, that the U.S. was reducing its presence in the region, that the U.S. was interested much more in other regions. The swing or shift to the Pacific, announcing ahead of time that the U.S. would be withdrawing from Afghanistan, giving a date, and making very clear, announcing, of course, the U.S. withdrawal and the reduction of our capabilities in Iraq, which created a huge vacuum and a huge loss of confidence, or at least questions in many people's mind, not just the Iraqis, but the neighbors, about what we would be doing there. And then, of course, the infamous line drawing, the red lines that we drew vis-a-vis what was going on in Syria, and us not having really effectively done much of anything to date to help the Syrian people, or what did exist as, I believe, a engageable moderate force at the time, which has, I believe, somewhat or maybe largely been overcome by more extremist groups. We missed all those opportunities, and in fact we signaled not only our withdrawal and our lack of interest, but vacuums that the bad guys, terrorists, people with interests that are contrary to our own, have filled. Big mistakes.
We periodically have these episodes that erupt. Rodney King in Los Angeles, Trayvon Martin in Florida, now Michael Brown in Ferguson. Do they have an impact? Can you identify change that has emerged in the wake of these episodes?
You know, most often not, unfortunately, because the way that they are framed oftentimes is, well, this is an exception to an otherwise just criminal justice system. Or it is framed in terms of the person, the victim, really deserved that and had that coming in a certain way. Let's take the Rodney King incident as an example, right? Now, most of us looked at that video footage and we saw a black man who was laid out on the ground and who was being beaten by 12 or 13 white officers, right? And that, you know, he posed no threat to them, but yet they continued to beat him. And when the claim of excessive force was raised and the officers were first acquitted, but then under federal civil rights statutes passed after the Civil War were prosecuted under those statutes, the lawyers who were defending the officers, they did something very clever, which I think is really emblematic of the ways in which we look and treat racism in our society. They took that video, which if you looked at in its entirety, had a certain narrative and a certain compelling visual effect on us with regard to this man being beaten and certainly excessive force being used. But they divided that video up into frames, piece by piece, and they showed it to the jury piece by piece. And they said with each frame, can't you see his right arm lifting up here? Don't you see his head lifting up here? A reasonable officer might think that he's in a position now to retaliate, that he still poses a threat. You know, frame by frame, they had their own little narrative with regard to how that should be interpreted, right? And giving the jury the facts in that way led the jury to do what it did and acquit. And so often we do that, don't we, with regard to race in general. We'll look at one episode, one frame, like the Ferguson frame or like the Rodney King frame, and we'll say that, oh, there's an explanation for that. That can be understood, that can be explained. We don't contextualize it and connect it to this history, this unfortunate, tragic history of institutionalized and prolonged forms of racism in which that particular instance was born from that history and that context. So without linking and connecting the dots that way, it's very difficult, isn't it, to have a sustained national conversation about the need to address a lot of these issues.
I regret we only have about less than a minute to go. Let's look into the future for a moment. Can you imagine a day when this is a history problem and not a current politics problem?
I can't. I mean, there are a lot of people who were rushing to characterize America in the wake of President Obama's election as a post-racial America, right? In which race no longer mattered. My God, if we could elect a black president, we certainly were beyond the days of Jim Crow segregation and discrimination on the basis of race. we know in no uncertain terms that is not true, that that's a fallacy. And it's a dangerous one because it often lulls people into a false complacency that there is not yet much monumental work to be done. So I can't see that far into the future. What I can see, though, is the need for multiracial, multicultural coalitions that are built around these issues that can sustain a movement for a long enough period of time that we're just not sad and sorry about what happened, but we're determined to do something about it.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الأفكار التي سمعتموها لحل مشكلات واشنطن، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.